Our next section involves who rules, and this took a look at a number of different types of governments that we have around the world. And one of the first ones that we looked at is any form of government with a single ruler would classify as an autocracy. Now that's going to be divided into two main types, where one person has all the power, with a monarchy and a dictatorship.
Okay, let's start with monarchy. That's the traditional king and queen ruling the country, and power is inherited through family line, typically the firstborn son. And a lot of the, if you've taken European history or just know about the kingdoms there, they started out as an absolute monarchy where the monarch would have complete control over the country. Since then, they still have monarchies in Europe, but they're constitutional monarchies, which means that the monarchs are still the head of state. They do a lot of the diplomacy and things like that. However, it's really more of a ceremonial position. There's still a constitution. They still have a republic. They vote for parliament and certain representatives, but there still are existing monarchies throughout the world.
Dictatorship is the one we're probably the most familiar with, certainly in a sense of former dictator Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Adolf Hitler, Bashar al-Assad of Syria. We hear that word dictatorship. One leader has absolute control over citizens' lives. The United States ousted Saddam Hussein several years ago when we invaded Iraq. People now are questioning, if you had to pick a poison, is it better to have a Hobbes viewpoint, to have someone like that in control? It's not the best, but it keeps stability in the region. Or what happens when you try to create a democratic government and you have different people competing?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, is it better to have a dysfunctional dictatorship that violates people's rights but keeps order versus a completely dysfunctional democracy that is closer to anarchy?
Right.
And really, neither of them are good situations. But the goal is to try to get towards a more secure and orderly state without having to take away everyone's rights.
Absolutely.
And that's the goal of each government.
Yeah, we'll take a look at democracy now. Citizens hold the political power. Two types of democracy. We're going to have representative democracy and direct.
Okay, representative democracy is the type that we have at our federal level, our national level of government. In that type of democracy, people have the power, but people don't engage in the day-to-day running of government or decision-making. They elect representatives to do it for them. In a country of more than 300 million people, it would just literally be impossible for us to have a direct democracy on a large scale. So instead, what we do is we vote in elections to elect leaders that represent us.
The form of democracy that would probably work best in maybe smaller communities, we showed pictures of ancient Greece, where you can have everyone directly participating in making the laws. Now, do we have forms of direct democracy today? Sure. At the state level, citizens can actually get enough signatures, and on a ballot, they can come up with their own initiatives where they can vote directly and make the laws directly. So we do see it today in various forms and in certain states around the United States.
Another example locally in the New England region, they have a lot of town meetings still that determine budgets and things like that. And every citizen in the town can go to the meeting and has their own particular vote. They don't have a representative at all. They vote themselves in those elections.
Correct.
Okay, an oligarchy is a small group that has all the power. An example of that would be a military junta, and that is where small groups of officers take over a government, overthrow the established regime, whether it be a dictatorship or a democracy or any other type of government, and then they control the country by brute force. They weren't elected, they didn't get it by family ties or heredity. They just take over the country with the military. Yeah, are there any examples of military juntas today?
Well, usually we would see something like this in maybe Central Africa. We do see governments that have broken down, and as a result, it's honestly who has the most guns or who has experience in the military and is then taking that for their own personal gain, a group of military officers. I know in our reading they mentioned the country of Myanmar or Burma for a while had a military junta ruling the country. And you could even maybe make the argument South Africa, not a military junta, but certainly an oligarchy, where maybe one group, in the case of different races, having political power for a while during the apartheid era.
Okay, that's a good example. An oligarchy doesn't have to be a military junta. There's other types of small group rule throughout the world.
Okay, theocracy. This is where we involve religion with this type of government. Now, with that, we see mostly Islamic republics typically have theocracies, but just because if you have a theocracy, does that mean that you're a dictatorship or you're a monarchy or you're a democracy? Does it apply to all of them? Is it just one? Why don't we take a look at where theocracy actually applies?
Okay, well, one example would be, like you mentioned, Iran. And that is an example of, in a republic, they have elections and they have representatives, but they also have Islamic law. Okay, so they are a theocracy. God's law is actually translated into, their civilian law, but they still have elections and representatives. It's not a dictatorship or any type. But so just know that theocracies, that's where you have the infusion of religion and civilian life and government. Unlike in the United States, where we have a clear separation of church and state, which is debatable, which we'll get through later in the year. But for the most part, the United States separates church and state, meaning separates religion from government. Some countries do not.
Of course, very similar to a state of nature is anarchy. No government, no control, no one's in charge, complete chaos. There are no rules, no laws. Anarchy is just that. And if any of you watch that show, Sons of Anarchy, it's about a motorcycle gang that kind of goes around. So we do see the term now and then.
And as far as a country having anarchy as a government, it doesn't exist. Because remember, one of the four parts of a sovereign state is a government. So if there is no government, anarchy, it doesn't actually qualify as a sovereign state. The only time that you get anarchy is when a state literally breaks down. Like sometimes throughout the last 20 years, parts of Somalia have had no government control. It's been basically anarchy. In parts of northern Iraq and Syria, once the Syrian regime fell, there's been anarchy in those places, and that's where groups such as ISIS and different al-Qaeda cells have been able to establish controls because there was no government functioning in those regions.
If you take a look at this chart here, who rules? This is pretty helpful. Just in the sense of organizing, how can we organize government and what are the different forms? So if you just take a look at this across, we just went through these various forms, but I think this is helpful in a visual sense where you may have no one ruling all the way along the spectrum to many people get to participate. Certainly the United States, we would fall onto the right side of that spectrum with a representative democracy and some components of direct democracy here and there.
Yeah, one thing to note is that the type of government that we left out there was a theocracy, and that's because theocracy could apply to any of these, except for anarchy. Okay, but we could have a theocracy that has one, few, or all. But just know that these are the main types of government that we see throughout the world today.